This is TWiT. Facebook's terrible, no good, very bad week in so many ways.
Oh,
Not great.
no.
Started
not great.
last Sunday with the 60 Minutes interview. The Facebook whistleblower finally came forward. Her name is Frances Haugen. She worked for a couple of years at Facebook. What was her title? She was working on.
She was a data scientist.
She's a data scientist, and I think she was working on election fraud.
She was like on the information integrity team or something like that.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
But, and I don't think she went there to blow the whistle or anything. I think she legitimately wanted to help Facebook do a better job. But when she saw what was going on, she started amassing documents from other departments, things she had access to but wasn't working on, and released them eventually to the Wall Street Journal, which has spent 2 weeks doing its Facebook files, bit by bit revealing things. And I guess the top line was, Instagram makes young women feel terrible. Facebook knows about COVID-19 fraud but can't do anything about it. And in her division, Facebook, the day after the election, stopped protecting people from misinformation, which possibly had something to do with the January 6th insurrection. So that was Sunday night. The next day, Facebook, completely coincidentally, demonstrates to the world why it desperately needs Facebook by going offline for 5 hours. Some people might have had the opposite conclusion. I don't really need that so much. But Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp go down. The world trembles. 3.5 billion users go, what happened? It turns out that was an error by an engineer in one of their backbone facilities. Facebook published a post, which I think is accurate. You never know with Facebook. It's not fully detailed, but it's the way they work. They have a lot of network operations centers, all of which are interconnected via a backbone. So you'll request an image from one, and it can ask for it via its private backbone from the other. Those backbones are commonly taken down and updated. In this case, one was being taken down. They ran a program that was supposed to test backbone capacity before they put it back up. The program had a bug, and in the process, they turned off all of the backbones, then all of the routers, and then, and imagine this at Microsoft, they turned off all of the security stuff so they couldn't even get into the network centers to fix the problem. The card readers stopped working.
They had to like dispatch like special ops teams kind of like to the data centers from what I read to say like to get in and actually
with wire
get the stuff
cutters,
back online.
with bolt cutters.
No, because I mean, at that point, if you've broken everything to the point that you can't get inside the buildings, I mean,
Woof.
we've had internal stuff go down before, where like our internal, like SharePoint or Teams or email went down, and that sucks. Like, don't get me wrong, like that's awful, but I can't. I mean, when it's as bad as like the building doors don't unlock, oh my God, I can't even imagine the amount of terror and just like triage that had to go into place to get things back online, and then it takes hours once you do change the configuration thing for everything to repopulate through
Right.
DNS and to get the BGP routes reset again, as well as standing up stuff that got shut down that isn't used to being down. I mean, and then I'm sure testing everything to make sure everything's working the right way. I'm not a fan of Facebook, but I had nothing but empathy for the engineers that had to work on like getting that back up, because the pressure must have just been terrible. Because as you said, 3.5 billion people, it's your internal systems would be bad enough, but then all of your external systems, all of your customers, nothing is happening. You're hearing, I'm sure, nothing but phone calls from people screaming, when is this going to be done? Like there's a term we use in the industry called hug ops, kind of like, giving like empathy for the people who have to build stuff back up again. And
is there an emoji for that? I want a hug ops emoji. I like that.
There should be an emoji for that. But I mean, like I said, I don't think Facebook is the greatest company, but I had nothing but empathy for that scenario, because that's just nightmarish. I can't even imagine.
It doesn't look like it was human error. It looks like it was, as always in these cases, a cascade of unexpected consequences that brought everything down. And by the way, Cloudflare, which had a great blog post trying to understand this before Facebook revealed what really happened, pointed out that this affects everybody because suddenly all these requests to Facebook are getting rejected, and so people keep refreshing and they keep hitting refresh.
Right, which just makes it worse, right?
The whole internet gets suddenly sluggish. We're so interdependent. I have to admit, and this is just paranoid Leo, I imagine Mark Zuckerberg in his mountain lair saying, we'll show those people and pull the plug for 1 minute, make it 5 hours. But it didn't reflect well on Facebook. I don't think they would have done that. So the weird thing is it went back down for another 2 hours on Friday. Mm-hmm. You would think that, we got this all. We're never going to let that happen again.
We tested everything, right? We checked it all out, right? You guys tested that, right?
Twice?
You checked it
in 1 week? Yeah. Twice?
Right. I mean, I have to imagine, and I don't know what happened with that one, but I have to imagine when you're standing stuff back up and you're in such a hurry and you have so much pressure to get it back up, that maybe something wasn't, propagated the right way and something was misconfigured when it came back online. Who knows? But at least that one, I think it just seemed like it was a normal outage. It wasn't like, okay, internally everything is down and externally. I mean, because to me, that's the nightmare scenario of everything being down everywhere.
It wasn't intentional, but it did underscore how important Facebook is to the world economy, especially in countries like Brazil, where everybody uses WhatsApp. And not just for talking to each other, but for business. So many, many mom and pop businesses lost thousands of dollars due to the outage. It really shows how interconnected and how important, how into the wiring Facebook is, which just to me means another reason we got to really scrutinize them.
Well, the WhatsApp seems like thing is a great example.
Yeah, I was just saying all the stuff that we've heard recently with Apple and antitrust as well, but Facebook has also been under scrutiny for that. And I think it is a good example of the fact that there are so many services and so many things that depend so heavily on it. I was thinking back to, I was on vacation in Mexico a few years ago, and if you were in your room and you wanted to contact the front desk, they didn't have phones. You WhatsApped the front desk to ask for services and stuff. Yeah, that was just the way it was, right? And it's like, it's so prevalent and so people are so dependent on it that you have that moment of being like, well, is this a monopoly? Like, is this something where they control so much of this? But because it's so global rather than being focused in the U.S., you don't see as much scrutiny on it, at least from like the U.S. government.
So
you're exactly right. Like I've even dealt with big brands in other countries where their customer service is almost exclusively through WhatsApp. And and it's, it's just like, that's just the way that you contact people.
So the whistleblower testified in front of the Senate, the Commerce Committee, on Tuesday. And basically said it's time for Facebook to declare moral bankruptcy, which I thought was an interesting concept. We know about email bankruptcy, where you just you throw up your hands and say, I'm never going to get to your email. I'm throwing them all out and starting over. Her opinion was Facebook should say, we didn't mean to create this monster, but it's a mess and we don't know how to fix it. Help us. I'm not sure I agree, and I'm very curious what you all think. I'll start with you, Dan. I don't know if I think Congress is the place to go for help, because I don't think anybody who thinks Finsta is a Facebook service clearly should not be in a position to regulate Facebook. That was, of course, Senator Blumenthal.
It's hard to say, because the question is, when you get to that size, and Apple is also in a position that's dealing with this right now, there really aren't a lot of other things to turn to besides government regulation, right? I mean, the market is so self-sustaining at that point because it's so big and it keeps getting bigger, that I think that it's really tough to be like, well, the competition will take them down. I mean, how could you start a competition at this point to take on Facebook?
Nor could users.
The stakes are so large.
We've seen dump Facebook movements, but they've not in any way impacted.
It doesn't catch on, right? Yeah. I mean, I think that's the question is, and I agree that the Congress is not always the most technologically savvy, but I think in terms of sort of trying to figure out like, what are the tools we can deploy? They may be the only, they may be the only recourse at this point, because I don't know. The problem, it kind of goes even larger than this in some ways, because as long as Facebook has that, obligation to its shareholders to try and maximize value, they're going to try to make as much money as possible. And sometimes that's going to mean cutting those moral corners. And I don't think there's an incentive for them not to do that, despite what Zuckerberg says.
Christina, very famously in 98, the Department of Justice sued Microsoft
Yep.
And while, it went on for a decade and eventually there was a consent decree, I think it's safe to say that was successful in the sense that it got Microsoft to kind of sit back a little bit, not be so aggressive in the market, not pursue its monopoly. One of the things Microsoft does is kind of Facebook's taking a page from that playbook is if there's a competitor, invite them in, find out how they'd work, then either buy them or steal their technology and duplicate it. Microsoft used to do that, engulf and devour. But they stopped.
Embrace, extend, extinguish.
Yes, that's the word. That's the phrase. So, but I think it's fair to say that DOJ investigation succeeded in stopping. And here's the interesting point. It forced Microsoft to reassess, do the right thing, pivot, and actually become a stronger company under Satya Nadella with web services.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I think the interesting thing there, I mean, obviously there were different scenarios. I think that I've talked to people who, I mean, obviously this was decades before I worked at the company, right? And so I don't know what was happening then.
You don't speak for the company in any respect.
No, I don't. I don't speak for the company in any respect. But and this was decades before I worked there. But what the circumstances with that, I think people that I've talked to who either were there then and some of them are still at Microsoft, some of them aren't, what they've said is that it did maybe change like the nature and how things were focused in the company. And the culture, but it took a long time. There was a dark period after that investigation where the company did suffer for a long time. So I think you can look on the net of it that even though the DOJ investigation was ultimately unsuccessful, like Microsoft won an appeal. They weren't broken up. There were some consent things and some changes that were made, but ultimately the government didn't win. There were still, by going through that process, I think it's impossible to say that there wasn't substantive impact on the company. But what's interesting is that although that, I think you could look at it and say, well, see, this had a good impact. It also did during that period of time. If you look at like when the appeals and all those things were happening, was the exact same time that Google and Facebook were really starting to build up and rise.
You can make the case that if Microsoft hadn't been slapped down, Google and Facebook might not exist.
Right, and so I'm not opposed to government intervention, and I'm not opposed to there being regulations. I think that that's important. I'm with you. I'm a little bit leery sometimes, I think, on just deferring to them because I don't think they understand the technology well enough. And I do feel like sometimes some of these things that are interconnected to the point where, I mean, this is actually, I think, something that some of these companies, Facebook in particular, have learned from the Microsoft, lawsuit stuff, is that the way that they've built their services together, it would be very difficult to break them apart in a traditional way. So I'm in favor of more oversight and regulation if it's done the right way, but I'm also kind of leery about what impact it can actually have. I mean, if your goal is really just to slow down the business and make them have to reassess, then say that. But if you're saying that your goal is to actually, make some sort of substantive change on a policy level, I guess I'm a little bit more cynical and skeptical that that's actually going to be achieved through legislation.
What do you think, Daniel? Can we learn anything from what the DOJ did with Microsoft? Is that any template for what could happen with Facebook? Would it work?
This is a very, obviously, as you all pointed out, complicated problem.
Yes.
One that we've predicted and seen even in dystopian movies like Blade Runner and RoboCop, where we always see the runaway corporation that becomes so vital and crucial to the infrastructure and systems that it's almost impossible to displace it without taking down the entire system. And that's where these services are headed. I'm not sure we're there right now. Facebook went down, and as you pointed out, there were some ramifications from it, but it's not like we headed towards nuclear war. It was just very inconvenient.
As far as you know, Daniel, as far as
we know, right. But you're also right where traditionally government intervention would be the solution here, but as demonstrated this week, the government is quite, at this point, incapable of understanding the technology. And it's easy to make fun of them for that. However, if you don't do this stuff full time, it is very difficult to understand all those details. I'm not really sure where we go from here. I'm actually pretty down on this stuff because I don't see any obvious solutions to fixing this. Dan pointed out, correctly that there's no incentive here. Capitalism is an amoral system. So I always kind of chuckle when people say, these companies are doing the wrong thing. It's like there is no wrong or right. The only wrong or right is internally is, do they make money for their shareholders? That's literally all that matters. So it's a little weird to give moral lessons to Facebook, who clearly don't care, and it's not in their charter to care.
Well, but in this respect, we are maybe making them care because it could impact their business, right? So there is a little bit of a stick that government and the Department of Justice can wield, saying, well, we can hurt you financially. And so if you're thinking long-term financial success, you might say, maybe we should be a little bit better at what we do.
It's just historically where we come down to like fines from the government. They've always been, these companies make so much money now.
Yeah, it doesn't matter.
They just paid off.
Yeah, look at the EU fines. Google pays $168 million. Big deal. It's nothing.
Can they financially hurt them? Is that possible? Like, how big of a fine do you have to leverage to get to a point where it is a major disruption? I mean, there was the whole thing about when when Facebook went down for 5 hours and Mark Zuckerberg lost $7 billion. And everyone's like, boo-hoo, he's got $120 billion.
And he'll get it back. In fact, he probably has already.
He'll make it back. Yeah. So can you hurt them? I don't know if you can.
Mark Zuckerberg's response to the testimony was very typical Facebook, which is a lot of hand-waving, misdirection, and ultimately Facebook says, yeah, regulate the internet, get rid of that section 230. We don't like that, which had nothing to do with this at all. He writes on Facebook, which I would, as you could see, I'm not logged in because I don't have a Facebook account, but I can kind of read what you want to see more of Mark Zuckerberg on Facebook? No, thank you. No. He wrote, many of the claims don't make sense. Now, Mark is a smart guy. Went to Harvard. Maybe he didn't graduate. Okay, but he went to Harvard. He's a smart guy. If we wanted to ignore research, he says, why would we create an industry-leading research program to understand these important issues in the first place? Well, maybe you created it and then didn't like the answer. Ever think of that?
Let me answer your question with a question.
If we didn't care about fighting harmful content, why would we employ so many more people dedicated to this than any other company in our space? Why? I ask you. If we wanted to hide our results, why would we have established an industry-leading standard? This I question, for transparency and reporting on what we're doing. What we know is Facebook is actively defeating the attempts from outside investigators like at NYU from seeing this material. They didn't want to release this material to the public. They were forced to by this whistleblower, and even then only released a little bit of the research, not all of it. Yeah, that's the question, Mark. If you didn't care about understanding these issues, why would you create an industry-leading research group and then bury the results? And this is what I think Facebook ought to do. Now, I don't know if you can make them do this, maybe shame them into doing this. They need to not only release the results of their research, but they have to open themselves to outside researchers. And then we all need to hear the results. And then we as a society can decide. If it does, in fact, turn out, Facebook kind of says, well, in 12 out of 13 points, young women feel better on Instagram. It's just that 1/13th. And by the way, Frances Haugen said, do not buy this because only 10% of people who smoke die of cancer. It's still a problem. Okay? And Facebook is really acting like big tobacco here.
I don't think you can shame them. I mean, that's the other thing. I mean, I'm not sure there's any way to shame them. If they, again, Daniel reiterated, like, if it doesn't make money, that's the only thing that actually makes a difference to them. So I think they have shown they have no shame, and that is not a good way to leverage them.
I also think that they've convinced themselves that they are acting morally and ethically in the right way, and that they have good intentions. I don't have as many friends who work at Facebook anymore as I used to, but I've known, many people
They're good people
who've worked there.
Yes.
Yeah, very good people. That's the thing.
Yes.
And many of them, I mean, especially 2016, and that was when the public shift really started to happen, was around 2016 and around a lot of the misinformation stuff, when the stuff about Cambridge Analytica came out, Myanmar, the election integrity stuff. And internally, a lot of the people that I knew who worked there had a really hard time with the public perception changing, because many of them, and they're very moral people, they're very upstanding people, who were like, no, but we're trying to do good things. We have good intentions, and they had a really hard time with, I think, dealing with like the disconnect between the public perception, or the growing public perception, and what their internal view of themselves were. And so even now, I still feel like most of the people who work there, especially the executives, A, I don't think they can be shamed, but B, I think that they've convinced themselves that no, we're doing the right things, and the way that we're going about these things is for the good of everyone. Yes, of course, it makes us money, but we're on the straight and narrow. So trying to convince them, if genocide hasn't been enough to convince them, say, hey, maybe we need to take a serious look at how our platform is being used, I'm not sure if the health of teenage girls is going to move the needle.
I think that's a really good point with the institutions in terms of institutional memory and how things operate. We have to think of even some of the worst dictatorships in the world. They didn't think they were doing evil. No. You have to understand that. Like, those people doing those things thought they were doing the right thing. So shaming people at Facebook is really not going to change anything, because they have to believe that what they are doing is the right thing and the appropriate thing. I think the most that's going to come out of this, we'll probably see like government commercials and ads talking about your kids and don't let them on Facebook for too long. I think it's going to be like the anti-smoking campaign. And I don't think it's until the system gets fundamentally changed and turning governance of how corporations are run. I don't think any of this is actually going to affect Facebook in the long term. We haven't seen it in their stocks. We haven't seen it in the user base. They're kind of impervious, and most governments are, too shy to actually do anything. And the most worrisome thing I saw in that 60 Minutes interview was about how the best moderation happens in the United States, but the rest of the world, especially in emerging and developing countries,
there are too many languages. They can't.
And they don't have like almost any moderation. They're like, it's absolutely just horrendous, the stuff that gets posted there. And it's just like, that's the world we're building. And that's very, very frightening.
Yeah, if they're going to lose out anywhere, I think there's a very long-term thing where their user base tends to be older on average, I think. And that's part of the reason they acquired things like Instagram and WhatsApp, right? To expand beyond just the core Facebook. Because we've seen, most kids today, teens, et cetera, they're not spending time on Facebook. They spend time on TikTok or something more like that, right? So their user base will age out eventually, but they're also so huge at this point that they're going to just keep going for a really long time, regardless of whether or not that's where the place where people are going or not, because it takes a long time to run out of the billions of dollars they have.
The other thing I would add, and I'm sincere when I say this, while I acknowledge the issues, is that it isn't, I don't think it's fair to blame technology, big tech, social media for our own flaws. And this doesn't come out of Facebook. Facebook is a mirror of the world. It maybe is an amplifier. I think you make a case that it amplifies. But really the problem, the polarization, the issues with climate denial, all of the problems we have in this world are created by people, not by big tech.